My teacher said I needed to be punished. I replied, then make it worth it. And suddenly, everything changed between us. It started as just another ordinary day, or at least, that's what I told myself. I walked into the sunlit classroom, the familiar scent of old books mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby cafe. My notebook was clutched tightly in my hands, as if it could somehow steady the nerves I didn't even want to admit were there. She was already there, standing near the window, her posture poised yet relaxed. There was an elegance about her that seemed effortless, like she belonged to a world slightly apart from mine. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, catching the light just enough to make me notice it. And the moment our eyes met, I felt a small jolt, a subtle awareness that this was no ordinary teacher-student dynamic. As I approached, I tried to focus on the mundane details, the hum of the projector, the creak of the floorboards, but my attention kept slipping back to her. There was a quiet intensity in the way she scanned the room, pausing briefly on each student as if measuring, not judging, but truly noticing. When she finally looked at me, her gaze lingered just a second longer than necessary. That small pause made my stomach tighten and my pulse quicken in a way I wasn't expecting. I handed her my notebook, and our fingers brushed lightly in the exchange. The contact was fleeting, yet it left a warmth lingering in my palm, a subtle reminder that some moments could carry weight far beyond their size. She adjusted my notebook, her hand brushing against mine again, not harsh, not abrupt, but deliberate, as if she wanted me to feel the steadiness of her presence. There was a quiet hum of awareness between us, almost like a shared secret neither of us was willing to voice yet. I tried to focus on the lesson, but each word she spoke seemed to carry an undertone meant just for me. The faint scent of her perfume reached me again, mingling with the subtle sound of her soft laughter when a student stumbled over a question. That sound, warm, light, effortless, echoed in my chest in a way I couldn't quite explain. By the end of the session, I realized that something had shifted. It wasn't just curiosity or nervousness, it was an unspoken awareness, the kind that makes you notice the way someone tilts their head, the way their fingers graze the edge of a desk, or the quiet steadiness of their heartbeat in a moment of silence. In that first hour, I became painfully aware that this teacher, this confident, graceful woman, was about to change the way I thought about learning, about attention, and maybe even about desire. The spark had been lit. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I was curious, and a little afraid, of the answers. The days after that first class were no less ordinary, yet I found myself anticipating them in a way that surprised me. Even the mundane routine of taking my seat seemed charged with a quiet electricity. Today, I was unprepared, or at least, unprepared in the ways that mattered. A simple misstep during her lesson sent a ripple of tension through the room, but instead of scolding me in the standard way, she paused, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, a playful glint dancing in their depths. "You really need to focus," she said, her voice low but laced with amusement. "I think a little punishment is in order." My stomach twisted, a curious mixture of nerves and excitement. I knew she meant this in jest, yet the way she said it carried a weight that made me sit straighter. My mind raced, not with fear, but with the thrill of the unknown. As she moved toward my desk to explain the punishment, the faint brush of her hand against mine when she adjusted my notebook sent a warmth coursing through me. It was brief, unassuming, and yet electric, like the brush of a spark across dry kindling. I felt acutely aware of every subtle gesture, the tilt of her head as she looked at me, the soft curve of her lips when she smiled, the delicate way she adjusted her sleeve without breaking eye contact. The punishment itself was almost absurdly simple, a verbal challenge, a playful test of memory, but under her watchful gaze, even the most trivial task became charged. I could feel my pulse quicken as she circled the desk, her presence close enough that I caught the faintest scent of her perfume, a subtle mix of jasmine and warmth that seemed to cling to the air around her. Every glance between us felt loaded with meaning. She would pause mid-sentence, letting her eyes linger, and I would catch myself holding my breath, unsure whether she was testing me or simply noticing my reaction. My usual confidence felt fragile in the face of this subtle, teasing power. Yet the challenge thrilled me, I was drawn to the dance, the tension between respect and the quiet, unspoken attraction. When the exercise finally ended, she allowed herself a small, approving smile. "Better," she murmured, almost under her breath, yet somehow meant for me alone. The warmth of that tiny acknowledgement lingered in my chest far longer than the words themselves. As I packed my things, I realized that punishment had done more than correct a mistake. It had introduced a rhythm to our interactions, a game of subtle touches, fleeting glances, and unspoken curiosity. The classroom felt transformed, no longer just a place of learning, but a stage where every gesture, every look, carried the quiet possibility of something more. And I knew, even as I left the room, that I wanted to see how far this playful challenge could go. It wasn't in the classroom where our connection deepened, but in the quiet spaces between lessons, the library, the hallways, the moments that felt almost accidental but were somehow charged with intent. That afternoon, I found myself at the library, scanning shelves for a book I didn't even need, when I noticed her there, leaning slightly against the edge of a table, a stack of papers in her hands. The sun streaming through the tall windows caught the strands of her hair, giving them a warm, coppery glow that made it impossible to look away. When she saw me, there was that same faint pause, a moment where our eyes met and held. It wasn't overt, not a stare that demanded attention, but subtle, like a ripple across still water. My chest tightened, a quiet fluttering that reminded me of something I hadn't felt in a long time, anticipation, and maybe a little fear of feeling too much. I wandered closer, pretending to peruse the books, though I was acutely aware of every sound she made, the soft rustle of paper, the low hum of her breath as she exhaled, the slight tilt of her head as she concentrated on the page. When I finally reached her table, she looked up, and for a moment, the space between us seemed to shrink, charged with unspoken energy. "Looking for something specific?" she asked, her voice low and warm, threading through the quiet library. I shook my head, but didn't move away. Instead, I lingered, caught in the gravity of her presence. Her eyes scanned mine, measuring, acknowledging, as if seeing beyond the surface. Then, without warning, she leaned just slightly closer to show me a note on the paper I'd been glancing at. Her hair brushed the edge of my shoulder, and I felt a subtle warmth where our bodies nearly touched. It was fleeting, almost accidental, yet I could feel its imprint lingering in my chest, a gentle reminder that proximity could speak volumes. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. We simply existed in that quiet, suspended bubble of awareness, her soft scent, the warmth radiating from her arm as she adjusted a sheet, the almost imperceptible brush of her hand near mine. In that silence, I realized how much I had started noticing, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the quiet strength in her posture, the faint lilt in her voice that made ordinary words feel like secrets shared only with me. When she finally straightened, gathering her papers, I felt a pang of disappointment that the moment had ended, yet gratitude that it had existed at all. Our interaction had been nothing overt, nothing scandalous, yet it had changed something fundamental. I left the library with a heightened awareness, of her, of myself, and of a growing tension that neither of us had yet named but both clearly felt. It was in these lingering glances, these small, fleeting proximities, that the quiet spark between us grew, threading curiosity, desire, and unspoken understanding into every shared moment. And I knew, with a strange certainty, that this was only the beginning. It started as a routine correction, a simple slip-up during our session that should have been nothing more than a quiet admonishment. Yet when she looked at me, her eyes calm but carrying that familiar glint of mischief, I felt my chest tighten in anticipation. "I think a punishment is in order," she said softly, almost a whisper, yet it resonated in the air between us, making it impossible to ignore. I swallowed, a strange mix of nervousness and curiosity spiraling through me. I had known her to be precise, measured, authoritative, but there was something different today. A subtle shift in posture, the faint curve of her smile, suggested this punishment wasn't just about correcting a mistake, it was a moment designed to draw us closer. She approached, and as she did, her presence filled the space in a way that made it impossible not to notice. The faint brush of her hand against my arm as she gestured toward the desk sent a warmth that lingered far longer than necessary. It was fleeting, almost casual, but enough to awaken a subtle tension that had been building over weeks. The punishment itself was simple, a verbal challenge, a little exercise designed to make me think, concentrate, and perhaps stumble. Yet under her careful observation, it became far more than that. Every pause, every soft correction, seemed designed to heighten awareness of proximity, of presence. When she leaned in to guide my hand on the notebook, the warmth of her body brushing against mine created a quiet electricity that made me acutely conscious of every nerve ending. Her attention was unwavering. She spoke my name softly, guiding me through the exercise, and I noticed the subtle intonation in her voice, the slight lilt that seemed to carry both authority and something gentler, almost personal. The scent of her perfume enveloped me, mingling with the faint warmth of her hand near mine. Even the smallest gestures, adjusting my posture, brushing stray hair from her face, pausing to let her gaze meet mine, felt deliberate, intimate, and charged with unspoken intent. When the punishment was over, she allowed herself a small, approving smile. "Better," she murmured, and I felt the weight of her acknowledgement settle deep in my chest. It was a reward of sorts, but one that carried with it a quiet recognition of something unspoken between us. As I gathered my things, I realized the moment had done more than correct an error. It had drawn us closer, threading a tension of mutual awareness and subtle intimacy into our relationship. The punishment had become a game of connection, a delicate dance of respect, curiosity, and quiet desire, one that neither of us could ignore. I left the room with a heightened awareness, already anticipating the next moment, the next interaction, the next subtle brush of her hand that would make the ordinary feel entirely extraordinary. The room was quiet after class, the chatter of students having long since faded, leaving only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of papers. I hadn't planned on staying behind, yet something kept me rooted in my seat, waiting for her to pack up or glance my way. When she finally did, I noticed something different in her expression, a softness that hadn't been there before, a subtle vulnerability that made the air between us feel warmer, heavier. She closed her notebook slowly, almost deliberately, and then turned toward me. "You seem distracted," she said gently, not in the teasing way she had before, but with a quiet concern that made me suddenly aware of how transparent I probably looked. "I guess, just a lot on my mind," I admitted, unsure if I was revealing too much, yet compelled to be honest. She nodded, and for a moment, the silence stretched comfortably between us. It wasn't awkward, it was intimate. Her presence, the steady warmth of her near me, felt like a safe place. She shifted slightly, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, soft, reassuring, strangely grounding. I realized I could watch her for hours and never tire of noticing the small, effortless movements that made her so commanding yet approachable at the same time. "Sometimes it helps to talk," she said quietly, perching on the edge of my desk rather than her own. Her posture was casual but deliberate, her shoulder brushing mine as she settled in, creating a subtle, comforting closeness. I felt the warmth of her arm near mine and the rhythm of her breathing, steady and calm, almost hypnotic. We spoke, tentatively at first, about trivial things, assignments, deadlines, but gradually our conversation deepened. She shared a memory, a fleeting regret, a moment of doubt she rarely let anyone glimpse. The honesty in her voice, the way her gaze softened when she looked at me, made my chest tighten. I realized I was seeing a side of her reserved for very few, and the gravity of that trust pressed gently on my heart. I found myself opening up too, revealing thoughts I usually kept buried. She listened, fully present, occasionally reaching out to touch my hand or shoulder lightly, a reassuring gesture that anchored me in the moment. Each touch, though brief, carried warmth, intent, and the quiet promise of understanding. By the time we stood to leave, the air between us had shifted. The playful teasing of before had deepened into something far more potent, trust, respect, and the fragile beginning of emotional intimacy. Walking out of the room, I felt it in my chest, a connection that went beyond curiosity or flirtation. Something real had begun, subtle and tender, yet impossible to ignore. The vulnerability we shared didn't need words to define it, it lingered in glances, in the soft touch of a hand, in the unspoken understanding that we were beginning to see each other in a way no one else did. And I knew, even then, that this moment would echo far beyond the quiet classroom. The days had grown warmer, and the routine of our interactions had developed a rhythm all its own. Yet something shifted the afternoon I found her sitting alone in the small courtyard behind the school, a book resting open on her lap, sunlight catching the edges of her hair. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, I thought the world had narrowed to the space between us. The usual playful energy was there, but beneath it, a quiet tension hummed, something heavier, more vulnerable. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, though of course she didn't need to give permission. She gestured to the space beside her, and I settled down, careful to respect the unspoken boundaries. But even as I did, I felt the brush of her sleeve against mine, a small, accidental contact, yet enough to make my pulse quicken. The faint warmth radiating from her shoulder was grounding, yet it carried a subtle, unspoken electricity. We began with small talk, the kind that seemed inconsequential, yet the silence between sentences was more revealing than the words themselves. I watched the way her fingers traced the edge of the page, the way her eyes shifted when she hesitated, and I realized that neither of us had to speak to communicate the curiosity and care we felt. Each glance, each pause, carried a meaning we both understood but neither named aloud. At one point, she leaned slightly toward me, as if to point something out in her book. The movement was casual, yet her shoulder brushed mine, and the warmth of her presence pressed gently against me. My chest tightened, my thoughts racing, yet I didn't pull away. Instead, I lingered in the moment, aware that the silence itself was a confession, one we were both too cautious to voice. Her gaze met mine, steady, soft, and full of something unspoken. It wasn't desire in a fleeting sense, it was deeper, almost sacred, the recognition that the space between us had become charged with understanding, longing, and care. My heartbeat quickened, yet I found comfort in it, in the unspoken acknowledgement of the connection that had been quietly building for weeks. We parted that day without a single word of confession, yet the energy between us had shifted irrevocably. The shared glances, the brief touches, the pauses in conversation, they were all silent promises, a quiet acknowledgement that the bond we had formed was real, tender, and slowly but surely blossoming into something profound. Walking away, I realized that sometimes the most significant confessions don't need words. Sometimes, the weight of a glance, the brush of a hand, and the steady presence of someone who truly sees you are enough to speak volumes. And in that silent acknowledgement, I knew we were both holding on to a truth that would soon demand recognition. The weeks of small moments, lingering glances, and quiet touches had built to this. I found her in the familiar classroom after everyone else had gone, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the blinds and casting soft stripes across the floor. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee, yet beneath it lingered the subtle warmth of her presence. She looked up from her papers as I entered, and for the first time, I felt that the invisible distance between us had dissolved into something tangible, something mutual. "I stayed a little late," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of familiarity and a hint of hesitation, as if testing the boundaries we had both been careful to respect. "I didn't want to leave just yet," I replied, feeling a courage I hadn't expected. My voice was steady, though my chest fluttered with anticipation. She smiled, the curve of her lips lighting up her face, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other, no words needed. The air between us was charged, not with tension, but with the steady comfort of emotional intimacy. Slowly, she closed her notebook and moved toward me, the faint brush of her sleeve along my arm sending a familiar, grounding warmth through me. Without thinking, I reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She leaned slightly into the gesture, and I could feel the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, a rhythm that mirrored my own. Our shoulders touched as we stood close, and I realized that all the teasing, the challenges, the subtle punishments, and the shared silences had led to this moment, a connection that was intimate, respectful, and wholly ours. "I think," she began, then paused, searching my face for understanding. The hesitation only deepened the sincerity in her eyes. I nodded gently, giving her the space to continue without needing to speak the words aloud. Instead, we shared a quiet embrace, her arms slipping around my shoulders, my hands resting lightly against her back. Her cheek pressed briefly to mine, the warmth of her skin and the soft rhythm of her breath grounding me in the reality of us. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, it was deliberate, tender, and brimming with unspoken acknowledgement. We pulled back slightly, our hands lingering together, fingers entwined as though testing the waters of what had become undeniable. Our smiles met, a shared understanding that the journey we had begun with teasing and subtle glances had grown into something real, something deep. As we walked out together into the soft evening light, the quiet comfort between us spoke louder than words ever could. The spark that had begun with curiosity and playful challenges had blossomed into trust, care, and a connection that felt both exhilarating and safe. In that moment, I realized that the slow burn path we had taken, the patience, the vulnerability, the silent confessions, had brought us to a place where warmth, intimacy, and affection could exist naturally. And for the first time, I felt wholly certain that this connection, built on respect and understanding, would endure. If this slow burn story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss more stories of forbidden attraction, unexpected connections, and age gap romance. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which moment in the story moved you the most.